So, what we're going to do today is try to reconstruct a life, and not just by looking at the familiar scriptures. We're going to try and place that story right back into the world that actually shaped it. The history, the culture, the politics of first century Judea. And look, this isn't about trying to replace the Bible, not at all. It's about listening to it more carefully, hearing all those echoes of its own time. And that really brings us to the central question for this whole explainer. What we're going to do is layer on all these historical realities, everything from Roman occupation to specific Jewish customs, right on top of the gospel narrative. And the hope is we'll see what kind of new clarity, what new understanding emerges when we really listen to all the evidence we have. And hey, just to be super clear about our approach here, this is really an exercise in historical discipline. We're trying to restore that human world, the one the Bible often just assumes its readers know about, but doesn't always spell out in detail. So think of it as a reconstruction, right? It's told with a ton of respect for faith, but also without being afraid to ask some honest questions. All right, so let's jump in right where the story does. The world Jesus was born into, it's really not that calm, peaceful scene you see on a Christmas card. Not even close. It was a world that was just wound tight with fear, with anxiety, and with military occupation. So Rome had this fancy name for it, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But let's be real, it was a peace that was enforced by the constant threat of violence. You'd see Roman standards, soldiers, even crosses along the roads, all daily reminders of exactly who was in charge. And ruling on Rome's behalf, you had King Herod. Now, this guy was a brilliant builder for sure, but he was also deeply, deeply paranoid. He saw enemies around every corner. In a world like that, just hoping for a deliverer, for a messiah, that was a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And right into this incredibly tense world steps Mary. And you have to remember, she was probably just a teenager, maybe 14, 15 years old. She was betrothed to Joseph, and that wasn't like a modern engagement. It was a binding legal contract. So an unexplained pregnancy, that wasn't just a social scandal. It was a full-blown legal crisis. In a society completely obsessed with honor, she could have faced public accusation and absolutely devastating consequences. And this right here, this is such a crucial moment in the story. Joseph, legally, had every right to protect his own honor by accusing her, by making it public, but he didn't. He chose a much harder path. He chose to protect her, even if it meant quietly losing his own standing in the community. His decision, that choice of compassion over his legal rights, is literally what allows the whole story to even happen. And that same kind of grounding in reality, it applies to the birth itself. Think about it. Bethlehem was packed because of a census. There was just no room. So the manger, an animal's feeding trough, that wasn't some poetic, symbolic choice. It was just practical. It's what was available. And that detail, it tells a story not of glory, but of a birth that was all about exposure and total vulnerability. Okay, so after all that drama surrounding his birth and the family's flight to Egypt, the scriptures basically go silent for decades. But we shouldn't think of these as just empty years like he was just waiting around. No, this was the essential time. This is when his character was being forged, day in and day out, in the ordinary rhythms of village life. You see, life in a place like Nazareth wasn't about climbing some ladder of ambition. It was about endurance. His days would have been shaped by these really steady, repetitive rhythms. Morning prayer, learning scripture by reciting it over and over, then long hours of manual labor, and then that sacred boundary of the Sabbath rest. It was a life lived sideways, not upward. No miracles, no big events, just the slow, steady formation of a young man. So Joseph trained him as a tekton, and that's a word that means something like a builder, someone who worked with both stone and wood. Now think about that kind of craft. A small mistake in measurement, a joint that's not set quite right, it doesn't cause a collapse right away. It happens later. And you have to imagine he learned this deep ethical lesson right there in his work. Our actions have delayed consequences, but they are certain consequences. We get this one single glimpse into all those silent years, the story of him at 12 years old in the temple. And when his frantic parents finally find him, his question, "Did you not know I would be here?" It's not some teenage rebellion, right? It sounds more like an honest, maybe even innocent recognition of his calling. But what's so crucial is what happens next. He immediately goes back with them and submits to their authority. It's this incredible moment of clarity, followed by many more years of quiet, patient obedience. Now, at some point during these silent years, it's pretty widely believed that Joseph died, because he just vanishes from the story. And if that's the case, that would have made Jesus the man of the house, suddenly responsible for his mother and his brothers and sisters. And that's not a single dramatic event you get over. It's the daily reality of grief, the weight of new responsibility, a quiet, constant loss that you can imagine would profoundly sharpen a person's compassion. All right, so after all those years of silent formation, he walks out into the wilderness. And this is not just some spiritual retreat to find himself. No, this is the pivotal moment of choice. This is where he's going to define the fundamental way his entire ministry will operate, specifically by refusing the world's typical models of power. We have to understand what the wilderness meant in Jewish thought. It wasn't just an empty, dead place. It was a place of confrontation. It's where the nation of Israel was tested for 40 years. It's where prophets went to get clarity. It's a place that strips away everything, all the noise, all the distractions, until you're left with only what you are most essentially committed to. He went there to find truth, not to show off how holy he was. And it's out there that he confronts these 3 timeless temptations, which are really just 3 very common models for success, even today. First, use your power to meet your own needs, to escape the limits of just being human. Second, use spectacle, use flashy signs to coerce people into believing you, to force them to be certain. And third, and this might be the most seductive one of all, use political power, use force to impose your version of justice without ever having to change anyone's heart. He says no to all 3. So here's the key takeaway from the wilderness. He didn't come out of there physically stronger. He didn't emerge with some new superpower. He emerged with profound internal clarity. He left aligned. The big question of his methods, how he was going to live and act, that was settled forever. He wouldn't dominate. He wouldn't coerce. He wouldn't manipulate. And this alignment, this decision, became the unshakable foundation for absolutely everything that was about to happen. And those choices he made out in the wilderness, they weren't just abstract philosophical ideas. They immediately became a very public way of life. He started to live out, to demonstrate what you could call an alternative kingdom. And this way of living directly challenged the world's most basic assumptions about everything, about power, about who is pure, about social status. And this drove the religious leaders crazy. They kept asking him over and over, by whose authority do you do these things? They just couldn't figure him out. I mean, he didn't have a degree from a famous rabbi. He didn't have any political connections. He didn't fit into any of their neat little boxes. And that made him a serious threat. Because here's the thing. His authority didn't come from some institution giving him permission. It came from his coherence. There was just no gap, none, between what he said and what he did. His words and his actions were perfectly, seamlessly consistent. And this profound integrity had this amazing effect. It made some people feel incredibly free, and it made people who held power feel deeply, deeply exposed. And you could see this challenge nowhere more clearly than at his dinner table. You have to get this. In that culture, sharing a meal with someone wasn't just about food. It was a profound statement of acceptance, of belonging. And who does he eat with? He consistently eats with tax collectors, who everyone saw as collaborators with Rome, and with prostitutes, and with other people labeled sinners, the real social outcasts. Now, to the moral gatekeepers of the day, this wasn't just weird, it was terrifying, because it completely collapsed all the social boundaries they used to stay in control. And then you have maybe his most radical teaching of all, to love your enemies. And look, this was not some call to have warm, fuzzy feelings for people you don't like. This was a strategic, even political act. The entire Roman Empire was built on the logic of us versus them, on the idea that some lives matter and other lives don't. So his command to love the enemy was a direct refusal to play that game, a refusal to dehumanize anyone. And in many ways, that kind of resistance is way more threatening to an empire than a violent rebellion. So when you live a life with that much coherence, with that much defiance, in a world that is completely built on fear, there's really only one possible outcome. The crucifixion wasn't some tragic accident that derailed his mission. It was the inevitable logical consequence of the life he chose to live. And, as we'll see, it was the necessary prelude to its ultimate meaning. Now, the resurrection is so often misunderstood. It wasn't some magical escape from suffering. It wasn't just hitting a rewind button on the cross. And he certainly didn't come back to lead an army and overthrow Rome. No, the resurrection was something different. It was the ultimate validation of his entire way of life. It reinterpreted suffering itself. It was the proof that a life of nonviolent, enemy-loving integrity was, at the end of the day, stronger than the worst that fear and power and even death could throw at it. And so, we're left with the question that his life poses to the world, both back then and right now, to us. Think about it. Pretty much every empire, every system of control, is built on one core assumption, that fear is the strongest force, the ultimate motivator. His entire life, from that vulnerable birth in a manger to his defiant death and the resurrection that followed, is a direct challenge to that one single idea. And it leaves us to wonder, what if fear isn't the strongest force shaping history? What if it's something else entirely?